Today, we are talking about a country that has been at the center of global attention again and again: Iran, a country that influences energy markets, regional conflicts, international politics, and at the same time, it's a beautiful, complex, a very unique country. And my goal today is not just to go through facts. I'm going to try to understand why Iran matters. Now, where do I even begin? Because Iran is one of those places where the deeper you look, the more complicated it gets. It's not a simple story. It's not a short story. Well, let's start simple. Take a look at the map. Modern Iran. What you see today is just one version of Iran, because historically, this country has constantly changed. At times, it was much larger, a major empire, stretching across huge territories. At other times, it was fragmented, weakened, and facing serious crises. Historically, it's a common pattern. First, rise, then reach a peak, then decline, recovery, over and over again. But here is something really important: the diversity of Iran. The majority of the population is Persian, and geographically they form this core right in the center of the country. But as you move outward toward the edges, things change. You start to see different ethnic groups, different languages, different identities. For example, Azerbaijanis, Turkmens. These groups are of Turkic origin. And then you have others who are quite different: Kurds, Arabs, different languages, different histories, different cultural traditions. So what you get is not a simple nation, but a layered civilization. And yet, despite all this diversity, this region has been connected by something stronger: a shared historical experience. Because civilization here developed very early. We are talking about a place where organized states, cities, and infrastructure existed thousands of years ago. In fact, at a time when parts of Europe were still figuring out the basics, Iran already had cities, administration, advanced systems of governance, and throughout history, this region followed a familiar cycle. A dynasty rises, it expands, it reaches its peak, then slowly it declines, weakens, and eventually falls, only to be replaced by another power. And then the cycle begins again. So when we talk about Iran today, we are not just talking about a modern country. We are talking about layers of history, layers of identity, layers of power, all built over thousands of years. Now, we could go all the way back to the very beginning, but it would take too long. So today, we are going to focus on the key moments, the ones that help us understand how Iran became what it is today. And one of the real turning points shaping politics and geopolitics today is the foundation of Shia Islam in Iran. To understand modern Iran, that's a crucial question. How did Iran actually become Shia? And to answer that, we go back to the 16th century. A nomadic Turkish group comes down from the north. There is chaos, fragmentation, power struggles, pretty standard medieval situation. And out of this turmoil, a new power rises, the Safavid dynasty. And this is where everything changes. The Safavid Empire is one of the biggest turning points in Iranian history. Before them, Iran isn't really a unified country. It's fragmented, different regions, different rules, no strong central identity. But the Safavids changed that. Now, here is the key point, and this usually surprises people. When Ismail I comes to power, Iran is not predominantly Shia. Most people in Iran at that time were actually Sunni Muslims. Shia communities existed, but they were smaller, scattered, not dominant. And then everything shifts. With Ismail I, Iran becomes a centralized state. It develops a distinct identity, and most importantly, he makes Shia Islam the official religion. Not gradually, not naturally over centuries. This is a top-down transformation. And this changes everything. Religion becomes tied to the state. Identity becomes tied to Shia Islam. And from this moment on, Iran starts to develop as something different from its neighbors. So when you look at modern tensions in the Middle East, Sunni versus Shia divisions, Iran versus other regional powers, a lot of it traces back to this exact moment. From that point on, Iran becomes fundamentally different from its neighbors, especially when you look at West, at the Ottomans. They are Sunni, powerful, expansionist, and very quickly become the main rivals of the Safavid state. So right away, religion isn't just belief anymore, it's geopolitics. And it's not just the Ottomans. Look to the east and northeast, Central Asia. At that time, you have powerful Sunni rulers there, including the legacy of the Timurid Empire, based in Samarkand. So if you imagine the map, Iran is basically sitting in the middle, surrounded by strong Sunni states on multiple sides. Now, let's talk about the scale of the Safavid Empire, because this wasn't some small regional kingdom. This was a large and powerful state. If you look at the map at its height, the Safavid Empire controls all of modern-day Iran, a huge part of Iraq, about half of modern Afghanistan, large areas of what is now Pakistan, and the Caucasus, including Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. Even parts of eastern Turkey and Syria fall under its influence at times. So yeah, this is not a small country. This is a serious empire, one of the major powers of its time. And here is an interesting detail. Today, Iraq is also largely Shia. That's not a coincidence. A lot of that traces back to Safavid influence and the broader regional dynamics that started in this period. But like almost every empire in history, it doesn't stay at its peak forever. There is a famous idea you've probably heard: strong times create weak people. Weak people create hard times, and hard times create strong people again. It captures something real. Empires rise, stabilize, grow comfortable, and then slowly begin to weaken. And the Safavid Empire is no exception. When empires reach their golden age, something interesting often happens. People become comfortable. The system works, wealth is flowing, things feel stable. And over time, the very edge, the discipline, the drive, the toughness that built the empire starts to fade. So decline begins. Now, if conditions stay stable, that decline can be very slow. And this is the key part, if the situation becomes unfavorable, wars, economic problems, external pressure, black swan events. Then the process accelerates, and what looked like a slow decline can suddenly turn into a rapid collapse. And this is exactly what happens to the Safavid Empire. At its peak, the Safavids control something incredibly valuable: trade routes. They sit right on key parts of the Silk Road, the major network connecting East and West. Goods, ideas, money, everything flows through their territory. And of course, they profit from it. This is one of the main sources of their wealth and power. But then, the world starts to change. Europe is getting stronger, technologically, economically, militarily, and most importantly, they begin developing maritime trade routes, sea routes that connect Europe directly to Asia. And these routes bypass Iran. Trade that once had to go through Safavid territory now goes around it by ship, faster, cheaper, more efficient. It's a bit like building your entire business around a highway and then suddenly someone builds a faster highway somewhere else. And this hits the Safavid Empire hard. Its economic importance declines, revenues start to drop, and over time the stable becomes weaker. By the early 18th century, the situation is already critical. And then comes the breaking point. In 1722, the Safavid capital Isfahan is captured by Afghan forces. This is not just a defeat, this marks the effective collapse of the Safavid state. After that, things get messy. Iran enters a long period of instability, power shifts, no clear central authority. Basically, not a great time to be running a country, but eventually, out of this chaos, a new power begins to emerge. By the end of the 18th century, the Qajar dynasty rises. And this sets the stage for the next chapter of Iran's history, including something that will change everything again: foreign influence, and eventually oil. So, after this long period of chaos and instability, a new power finally emerges. The Qajars were a Turkic tribal dynasty, and in 1796 their leader crowns himself Shah, establishing a new ruling system that will control Iran for more than a century. So, order is restored, at least on the surface. Now they make an important decision early on. They move the capital from Isfahan, the old Safavid center, to Tehran, where it is still the capital now. Let's step aside from the timeline for a moment, because we need to talk about something absolutely crucial: oil, which Iran has a lot, and when it actually became important. Because before this point, the 19th century, Europeans weren't that interested in this region. And interestingly, they didn't care much about oil either. Oil itself is not new. People have known about it for thousands of years. They use it for lighting lamps, simple medical purposes, waterproofing. Useful, but not strategic. That changes in the late 19th century. This is the real turning point. The key invention here is the internal combustion engine. Suddenly, You have cars, trucks, eventually airplanes, and they don't run well on coal. They need refined fuels, gasoline, diesel, which come from oil. But the truly decisive shift happens at sea. Navies begin switching from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ships. And this is a game changer. Coal ships have problems. They are slow to refuel, they are dirty, they require huge crews. Oil-powered ships, faster, more efficient, much quicker to refuel. Basically, less smoke, fewer people shoveling coal, and a lot more speed. And when militaries, especially navies, start making this transition, everything changes. Up until now, the Industrial Revolution runs on coal, but oil begins to replace it in the most strategic sector of all, the military. At this point in history, the most powerful empire in the world is the British Empire. Britain is an island nation, and its strength has always depended on one thing: the sea. Trade, expansion, military power. All of it relies on ships, and that means the navy is the backbone of the empire. And Britain suddenly has a problem, a serious one. It doesn't have enough oil of its own. So in the early 20th century, the British government makes a critical decision to switch its navy from coal to oil. Because as we know now, it's faster, more efficient, more powerful, but it also creates something dangerous: dependence. Because now the entire strength of the empire depends on a stable supply of oil. And that raises the key question: where does that oil come from? The answer is Persia, modern-day Iran. Britain begins investing heavily in Iranian oil, and soon it establishes a company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Today you know it as BP. Iran becomes a strategic energy asset for the British Empire. Now, let's zoom back into Iran itself. At this time, the country is ruled by the Qajar dynasty, as we know. But the state is weak, financially strained, politically unstable, and heavily dependent on foreign powers, which makes it vulnerable. And because of this weakness, Britain is able to secure extremely favorable oil concessions. The terms are highly unequal. Now, during this period, the Shah of Iran is Mozaffar ad-Din Shah. He rules from 1896 to 1907, and he's not a particularly strong ruler. In fact, he inherits a system that is already in serious trouble. The Qajar state at this point is deeply corrupt. There is no effective national tax system, which means local governors collect taxes, and then, oh surprise, they keep the money instead of sending it to the central government. In other words, everyone is taking a cut. So the result is predictable: the state is constantly broke. And when the government runs out of money, what do? You borrow. And that's exactly what the Shah does. To keep the system alive, he begins borrowing from foreign powers, mainly from Britain and Russia. But these loans are not neutral. They come with strings attached. Things like economic concessions, political influence, and growing foreign control. Because loans like these are never just about money, they're about power. And this creates a very dangerous pattern, a cycle. The more Iran borrows, the more dependent it becomes. And the more dependent it becomes, the more it has to give away. More control, more resources, more influence. In other words, this is a classic debt trap. And once a country enters that kind of cycle, it's very hard to escape. Historically, most countries don't, at least not without a major crisis. And this brings us to the point where the British decide to begin searching for oil in Iran. And at the center of this story is a man named William Knox D'Arcy, a British millionaire, an investor, and you could say a bit of a gambler, because what he's about to do is risky. In 1901, D'Arcy approaches the Shah with a proposal. He offers to invest his own money to search for oil across Iranian territory, and in return, he wants the rights to explore, extract, and profit from that oil, if it's found. Now, today, this sounds like a huge decision. Here is a spoiler. They will have a deal where the British get 84% of oil and Iran gets just 16%. Pretty unfair, and isn't it an interesting question to answer why Shah so easily signed such a ridiculous deal? Not even 50-50, 84 to 16. Well, at the time, it doesn't feel that stupid. For the Shah, who is financially desperate, politically weak, and constantly trying to survive day to day, this doesn't look like a major risk. Honestly, he has bigger problems. Keeping the state afloat, dealing with internal corruption, managing foreign pressure. Oil? That's hypothetical, because oil hasn't even been discovered in Iran yet. So this deal doesn't look like giving away a fortune. It looks like buying a lottery ticket. D'Arcy is basically saying, let me spend my money searching, and if I succeed, we'll share the results. And from the Shah's perspective, that sounds like a pretty good deal. After all, if nothing is found, you lose nothing. But if something is found, then everything changes. Now, at this time, most of the world still runs on coal. Oil is not yet seen as a strategic resource. So, from the Shah's perspective, why not take the deal? But to really understand this decision, we need to zoom out for a moment, because what's happening here is actually something very common. It happens again and again whenever a new technology appears. At first, people don't take it seriously. It feels like a gamble, a risky idea, something uncertain. And honestly, most of the time, they are right, because innovations appear all the time, new ideas, new inventions, new breakthroughs. But how many of them actually become something big? Very few. So from the perspective of decision makers, this is just one more uncertain idea. And politicians are usually not engineers. They are not scientists. They are not sitting there calculating future energy systems. What is real to them? The money they have right now, the expenses they need to pay today. That's what matters. So when Muzaffar ad-Din Shah is asked to grant exclusive oil rights for 60 years, he doesn't see it as giving away something valuable. He sees it as solving an immediate problem. future consequences, that's future Shah's problem. And in fact, even after the deal is signed, nothing happens immediately. Time passes, a lot of time, from 1901 to 1908, 7 long years, 7 years of searching, digging, spending money, and finding nothing. At this point, the whole project starts to look like a failure. Darcy and his team are running out of money. They are getting dangerously close to bankruptcy. Imagine explaining this to your investors. Don't worry, we've been digging holes in the desert for 7 years. And then, after years of failure, in 1908, they finally strike oil. And just like that, everything changes again. Up until this moment, this was just a private venture, a businessman taking a risk, making a deal with a weak government. But now oil is real. Now oil has value. And suddenly, this is no longer just about one investor. This becomes a matter of national interest. Because when a resource turns out to be this valuable, powerful countries don't ignore it. They move in. And this is the moment when Britain starts paying attention. Around this time, a key figure enters the story. Winston Churchill. You might have heard of him. And he makes a crucial decision. The British Navy must switch from coal to oil. Why? It's simply better for war. I'll remind you that this is happening at a very dangerous moment in history. Britain is locked in a growing rivalry with the German Empire. An arms race, a naval race, a race for global dominance. All of that make it tougher, and all of that make oil important. And all of this is happening on the eve of World War I. Oil becomes a military necessity, a strategic priority. Here Britain moves in, and it buys a majority stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And from now on, Iran is no longer dealing with a private businessman. Now, it is dealing with the British Empire itself. And that is a completely different situation. Before, a weak Shah negotiating with a foreign investor. Now, a weak state facing one of the most powerful empires in the world's history. And this is the age of imperialism, and also the rise of global capitalism. Because in this world, contracts can be traded, concessions can be sold, rights can be assets. In other words, what starts as a risky deal can be packaged and resold, expanded, and backed by an empire. And that's exactly what Britain does. It takes a private agreement and turns it into a matter of national security. And now the balance of power becomes completely unequal. On one side, the British Empire, one of the most powerful empires in history. On the other, Iran, a large country but a weak state in decline. In other words, big fish eat little fish. And to understand that time, we also need to consider that the early 20th century was a turbulent political era. This wasn't just about one country, this was happening everywhere. New ideas were spreading across the world: socialism, communism, nationalism, ideas that challenged the old order, ideas that asked a dangerous question: who should really have power? And especially across Asia, old monarchies began to face serious pressure because people were no longer willing to accept absolute rule. They started demanding representation. They started demanding parliaments, limits on royal power. And it wasn't just the masses, even people inside the system, the elites, the educated classes, they could see that something was broken. They wanted reform, they wanted modernization, change. This was an age of revolutions. Not one revolution, not one country, a global wave. In 1905, a revolution broke out in the Russian Empire, Iran's powerful northern neighbor. It didn't fully succeed, but it sent a message, a warning, a sign of something much bigger. Something was coming, and Russia wasn't alone. In China, revolution would erupt in 1911. In Mexico, revolution was already underway. Societies everywhere were boiling. Old systems were beginning to collapse, and new ones were struggling to be born. And Iran was part of this wave. Inside the country, people saw foreign domination, economic weakness, the loss of past greatness, and this created something powerful: national pride, a desire to restore the country, a desire to make the country great again, not a particularly new idea. So, in 1905, Iran entered its own revolution, the Constitutional Revolution. For the first time, people demanded a constitution, and for the first time, Iran created a parliament, the Majlis. The Shah's power was reduced, and the country began moving toward a constitutional monarchy, toward a more modern political system. But this created a problem, not inside Iran, but outside it, because major powers, especially Britain and Russia, did not want a strong, independent Iran. So in 1907, without Iran's consent, they made a deal, the Anglo-Russian Convention, and they divided the country into spheres of influence: the north under Russian control, the south under British control, and the center a so-called neutral zone. In reality, Iran became a semi-colony, and when the parliament tried to assert real power, it was crushed. In 1911, Russian troops helped dissolve the Majlis. So now Iran had a constitution, but no real power to enforce it. Isn't it an interesting question why Britain and Russia would do this? Because of what? Well, for decades they had been rivals, competing for influence in Central Asia, the Middle East, key trade routes. This rivalry even had a name, the Great Game. But now a new threat was rising: Germany. And that changed everything. Alliances began to form. France aligned with Russia, Britain moved closer to both, and suddenly former enemies became temporary partners, especially because Britain feared for its most valuable colony, the jewel in the British crown, India. So instead of competing in Iran, they chose to divide it, and Iran found itself trapped between two powerful forces from 1911 to 1918. The situation only got worse. Foreign troops remained inside the country. Key institutions were influenced from the outside. The parliament was weak or inactive. On paper, Iran had a constitution. In reality, it had very little control over its own future. Then, in 1914, World War I began, and the entire world was shaken. Empires collapsed. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in Russia, a new power emerged, the Bolsheviks, bringing communism and strong opposition to imperialism. But Russia itself fell into chaos, a civil war lasting until 1922. And this had direct consequences for Iran. Before the war, Britain and Russia had shared influence over Iran, balancing each other. But now, the balance was broken. Russia collapsed. Its influence disappeared, at least temporarily. And suddenly, Britain was left as the dominant foreign power in Iran. This created a completely new situation. Before, Iran caught between two rival empires. Now, Iran facing one dominant power alone, and Britain saw an opportunity. It began to think, why not formalize this control? Why not turn influence into direct power? And this is the moment when Britain moves from influence to something much closer to control, full control. And this led to the Anglo-Persian Agreement. Officially, Britain presented it as something positive. They said, we will help modernize Iran, we will strengthen its army, we will improve its finances. But in reality, this agreement would turn Iran into a de facto protectorate. Let's look at what it actually meant. First, finances. Britain offered Iran a 2 million loan, £2 million, but it had to be repaid with 7% interest. Key revenues, like customs, were used as collateral, which means Britain effectively controlled Iran's budget and income. Second, administration. British advisors would be placed in finance, customs, but they were not just advisors, they had real decision-making power. Long story short, Iran kept the appearance of independence, but in reality, foreigners were running the state, the military. Britain would train the army, supply weapons, provide officers. It meant that Iran's military became dependent. And finally, infrastructure. Railways, roads, trade systems, all would be built by British companies. And behind all of this was a clear geopolitical goal. Lord Curzon wanted to create a buffer state to protect British India and to block the spread of the Soviet Union. Because now, after the Russian Revolution, a new threat had appeared: communism, anti-imperialist movements. Revolutionary ideas spread across borders. So in simple terms, Iran should exist, but only as a controlled state, serving British strategic interests. And how did Iranians react? With outrage, because this was not seen as reform, it was seen as betrayal, and the timing mattered. World War I had already shaken the old order. Before the war, European empires like Britain and France seemed unstoppable. But the war changed that. They suffered heavy losses. They depended on colonial troops. They ended up deeply in debt. Even Britain, the greatest empire in the world, became financially dependent on the United States. And across the world, this had a powerful effect. People in colonies began to think, maybe the empire is not invincible. Maybe resistance is possible. Maybe independence can be achieved. And Iran, this feeling turned into something stronger, national consciousness. So when Britain tried to formalize control, it triggered massive opposition. People saw it as a national humiliation, a country being sold to foreigners. And even worse, the Iranian parliament was ignored. The agreement was never properly approved, yet Britain acted as if it already was. This destroyed what little legitimacy remained of the Qajar dynasty, and opposition came from everywhere: intellectuals, clerics, merchants, different parts of society, united by one idea: resistance to foreign domination. And this moment marks the rise of something powerful: modern Iranian nationalism. At this point, Iran entered a full political crisis. A classic situation was emerging. The elites could no longer rule the old way. The people could no longer live the old way. This is the definition of a revolutionary crisis, and this crisis would eventually lead to the collapse of the Qajar dynasty and the rise of a new political order. So how did the situation reach this point? First, the political corruption. The prime minister was widely accused of taking bribes from Britain. Whether it was fully proven or not, the perception mattered more than the facts, because in a semi-colonial system, people often believed that. They believed that decisions were made behind closed doors. They believed that agreements were not in the national interest, that elites were serving foreign powers. This destroyed trust in the government. And to be honest, this pattern is not unique. It pops up again and again when the elites in a country want to change the government. Corruption is the universal argument for the masses, and it was deepened by material conditions. After World War I, Iran faced severe economic collapse, and then came another layer of instability. Iran was not a fully centralized state. It was a multi-tribal and regionally diverse society. As central authority weakened, different regions began to act independently. We see tribal revolts, regional movements, local power centers emerging. So by this point, Iran was no longer a stable state. It was a country where the government lacked legitimacy. All the elements of crisis were present. Plus, don't forget about the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the rise of the Soviet Union, which did not remain limited to Russia. It had a global impact across Europe. For a brief moment, several Soviet-style republics appeared in different countries: in Hungary, in Germany, in Bavaria. Most of them were short-lived, but they showed something important: revolution could spread. And this influence reached Iran. In the north of the country, especially in the Gilan region, a Soviet-backed state briefly emerged: the Persian Socialist Soviet Republic. This republic combined nationalism, socialism, anti-imperialism. For Britain, this was a serious alarm, because now the danger was clear: Iran might fall under Bolshevik influence, and become part of a wider revolutionary wave. So Britain changed its strategy. After the failure of the Anglo-Persian agreement, they realized something crucial. Direct control does not work. It creates too much resistance. So instead they adopted a new approach, indirect control. The idea was simple: do not rule Iran from the outside, rule it through a strong central authority inside. And here we reach an important insight: a strong ruler. It does not always mean a strong country, though. Very often, it means a country that is easier to control. In many colonial contexts, authoritarian rule can usually serve foreign interests better than democracy, because no free debate, no public opposition, no independent political forces, and without freedom of ideas, it becomes harder for society to say, we should act in our own national interest. This was exactly the situation Britain preferred. So they looked for someone who could restore order, suppress unrest, centralize power. And they found that figure in Reza Khan, a military officer from northern Iran. In 1921, he led the 1921 Persian coup d'etat. He led a military march into Tehran. The government collapsed quickly, and a new leadership was installed. From this moment, real power was no longer in the hands of the old elites. It was concentrated in Reza Khan. At first, he did not abolish the monarchy. Formally, the country was still ruled by Ahmad Shah Qajar, but in reality, the Shah was weak, absent, and unable to control the situation. Power had already shifted. Over the next few years, Reza Khan steadily strengthened his position, and in 1925 he made the decisive move. He removed the Qajar dynasty from power and declared a new monarchy, the Pahlavi dynasty. This marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in Iranian history. So we can clearly see the turning point: 1921, the coup, and 1925, the new dynasty. This transformation did not happen by accident. It was the result of political crisis. And in this situation, many people came to accept something important: a strong ruler instead of unstable democracy. Reza Khan presented himself not as a traitor, but as a nation builder. He likely saw himself in a similar role to another, indeed great leader in the region, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who had successfully saved Turkey, the neighbor of Iran. He successfully saved Turkey after World War I, defeated foreign intervention, and most importantly modernized Turkey by Western style. So Reza Khan aimed to do something similar in Iran, but Iran was a very different country. It was multi-ethnic, regionally diverse, politically fragmented, and most importantly, it remained a target of foreign powers. For empires like Britain, Iran was not just a country but a strategic asset, a buffer zone, an oil supplier. So even under a strong ruler, Iran was not fully free from external pressure. In many ways, it remained caught between internal transformation and external control. So, Iran entered a new chapter, and on paper it was constitutional monarchy, but in reality, centralized authoritarian rule. This tension between parliament and monarchy became a recurrent feature in modern Iranian history. At times, the parliament would try to assert itself. At other times, the Shah would dominate completely. First, the Shah introduced a series of reforms aimed at reshaping Iranian society. One of the most visible changes was in culture and daily life. Western-style clothing was encouraged. Traditional dress was discouraged. Religious clothing was restricted. In 1936, the state went even further, where women were forced to remove the veil. It was not optional, it was imposed from above. And this reveals something important. Modernization was not gradual, it was forced by the state. It divided society. Urban elites largely supported these reforms, but many religious and traditional communities were deeply offended. For them, this was not progress, it was an attack on identity and belief. And here we see the beginning of a long-term tension in Iran, modernization versus tradition, a tension that would shape the country's future conflicts. Reza Shah also focused heavily on education. He aimed to create a modern secular system. New schools were established, students were sent abroad, Western knowledge was promoted. In 1934, he founded the University of Tehran, which became a symbol of modernization. In the economy, he pushed for industrialization. At the same time, he worked to centralize power. Before his rule, many regions were controlled by tribes with significant autonomy. Reza Shah changed this. Gradually, power was concentrating in one man. So once again, we see the central paradox. Iran was becoming more modern but less politically free. A stronger state but a more controlled society. In foreign policy, Reza Shah Pahlavi followed a strategy of balancing great powers. His main goal was clear: to modernize Iran without becoming dependent on any single foreign power. But Iran's position made this extremely difficult. On one side stood the United Kingdom, with strong influence in the south and control over vital oil concessions. On the other side was the Soviet Union, a powerful northern neighbor with both political and ideological influence. Caught between these two forces, Iran needed a third option, and that option became Germany. Why Germany? There were several important reasons. First, Germany had no colonial history in Iran. It had never dominated the country. It carried less historical resentment. Second, Germany was geopolitically distant. It shared no border with Iran. It had limited ability to impose direct control. And third, and most importantly, Germany offered what Iran needed most: technology, industry. At the same time, it lacked the political leverage that Britain already had. So, for Iran, Germany looked like an ideal partner: useful, modern, but less threatening. This reflects a broader geopolitical pattern. Often that happens when countries seek alliances with distant powers to balance against nearby threats. By the 1930s, this strategy was clearly visible. Reza Shah actively worked to reduce British influence, limit Soviet pressure, and expand cooperation with Germany. One of the most important symbols of this policy was the Trans-Iranian Railway. This massive project connected the Caspian Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It was a major step toward economic integration, and it relied heavily on foreign expertise, including German engineers. More broadly, Germany became deeply involved in Iran's development, industry, infrastructure, technical education, administrative system. By the late 1930s, Germany accounted for 40 to 50% of Iran's total trade. This was a dramatic shift. British influence was declining. Germany was becoming a key partner. But this created a new problem, because by the late 30s, Germany was no longer just another state. It had become Nazi Germany, a powerful, expansionist regime challenging the global order, especially the British Empire. And this made Iran strategically critical. For Germany, Iran represented a possible link in a much larger vision, a corridor from Europe through the Middle East toward vital resources, especially oil. Access to oil was one of the Germany's biggest strategic weaknesses. So, any connection to regions like Iran was extremely valuable. For Britain, this was deeply alarming. When World War II began in 1939, Nazi Germany achieved a series of shocking and rapid victories. Germany introduced a new style of warfare. You might have heard of those fast-moving tank divisions, coordinated air and ground attacks, what later became known as Blitzkrieg. When Germany invaded Poland, Poland was defeated within weeks. France, the big empire, one of the strongest powers in Europe, was defeated in a matter of weeks. Paris fell. British forces were forced to retreat. It was a shock to the entire world. At this point, Germany appeared unstoppable. And this is where the war reaches a truly decisive moment. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest military invasion in history. Millions of soldiers advanced across vast front. At first, the Soviet Union suffered catastrophic losses. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Soviet Union might collapse. And now, imagine, in this enormous pressure, Britain and the Soviet Union turned their attention to Iran. Why? Because Iran had suddenly become strategically vital. Germany desperately needed oil. One of its major strategic goals was to reach the oil-rich regions of the Caucasus, especially Baku. If Germany succeeded, it could weaken the Soviet Union, gain access to massive oil supplies, potentially move further south toward Iran. So, this was one of the reasons. But second, there was the issue of supply routes. The thing was that the Allies, especially United States and Britain, began supporting the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. And they were doing it through the Northern Sea route. But it was dangerous because German submarines operated there. Norway was under German control. So an alternative route was needed, and that route was through Iran. From the Persian Gulf, supplies could travel north through Iran into the Soviet Union. This became known as the Persian Corridor. But there was a problem. Iran was officially neutral. However, for Britain and the Soviet Union, neutrality was no longer acceptable. The risk was too great. So this is why Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran. Iran could not resist. What makes this especially striking is how quickly it happened. At that very moment, both powers were under enormous pressure. Britain had suffered major defeats in Europe. The Soviet Union was facing catastrophic invasion by Germany, and yet they still managed. They managed to occupy Iran with ease. The Iranian army rapidly disintegrated. Many soldiers refused to fight. There was no coordinated resistance. Within days, the country was effectively under control. Reza Shah himself was forced to abdicate. He was taken by the British and sent into exile. His son, Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a tragic figure in history, he became the new ruler. He accepted the conditions of the Allies and allowed Iran to be used as a strategic corridor. But something unexpected happened next. During the occupation, Iran experienced a period of political opening. Although it remained officially a monarchy, real power shifted. The young Shah was weak, and the parliament regained influence. Political life became more active. New parties emerged. Nationalist movements grew. Communist groups became influential, especially in the north, in the Soviet area of occupation. For the first time in years, the constitutional system started to function more meaningfully. But this fragile balance did not last. When World War II ended in 1945, a new crisis began. The key question was, would foreign troops leave Iran now? The British began to withdraw, but the Soviet Union did not. Instead, it kept its forces in northern Iran. Even more importantly, it supported separatist movements. In the north, where many ethnic Azerbaijanis lived, the Azerbaijani People's Government was established. At the same time, in the Kurdish regions, another movement emerged, the Republic of Mahabad. For a moment, it seemed possible that Iran might be divided. This crisis became one of the first major confrontations of the emerging Cold War. But eventually, the Soviet Union was forced to withdraw its troops from northern Iran. This outcome was shaped by a major shift in global politics. World War II had just ended, but a new phase in international relations was beginning. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was never truly unified. It had always been a temporary tactical coalition. Now, its internal contradictions were becoming visible. The three main powers were fundamentally different. The Soviet Union was a socialist state under communist rule. The United Kingdom was a global empire. The United States, a capitalist democracy. And the problem was that each of those powers had its own vision of the post-war world. At the same time, a new dominant power had clearly emerged. The United States came out of the war as the strongest country in the world. It had enormous economic power. It had global political influence. And most importantly, it had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. In the immediate post-war years, this gave the United States a decisive advantage in shaping global outcomes. In this new context, the situation in Iran became an international issue. Iran appealed to the United Nations, arguing that its sovereignty was being violated. The United States supported Iran and increased pressure on the Soviet Union. For the Soviet leadership, this created a serious dilemma. On one hand, they saw northern Iran as a potential sphere of influence, similar to Eastern Europe. On the other hand, they were now operating within a new international system, And as a founding member of the United Nations, the Soviet Union was expected to respect the principle of state sovereignty. Under growing diplomatic pressure and without full freedom to escalate the conflict, the Soviet Union chose to withdraw. By 1946, its troops left northern Iran, so Iran avoided division. The separatist movements collapsed, and the country remained territorially united. Though its sovereignty was still limited, the United Kingdom continued to dominate Iran's most valuable resource, oil. At the same time, the political situation inside the country had changed dramatically. We remember that Reza Shah had been forced into exile, and his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, was young and politically weak at that time. This created something new: more political freedom, a more active parliament, rising public participation. Iranian society became increasingly vocal and politically engaged. So it led to something new. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister. He represented the National Front, a movement that aimed to restore national control over Iran's resources. Mossadegh made a bold and unprecedented decision. He pushed parliament to nationalize the oil industry. This meant something crucial: ending foreign control and expelling the British company at all. Zero. Creating a new state-owned entity. Instead of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, they created the National Iranian Oil Company. For Iran, this was a moment of national sovereignty, but for Britain, it was a major loss. From the British perspective, they had invested heavily over decades and now risk losing everything. The response was immediate. Britain launched an economic campaign against Iran: oil embargoes, financial pressure, international isolation. This became known as the Abadan crisis. The Iranian economy was severely affected. But despite this pressure, Mossadegh remained firm. He defended Iran's position at the United Nations and the International Court of Justice. He argued that Iran had the sovereign right to control its own resources. Inside the country, he became a symbol of nationalism and independence. Even the Shah, despite his limited power, formally supported the nationalization. Parliament approved it. It was a democratic decision, but this is exactly what made it dangerous for foreign powers. Because when people are allowed to choose freely, they surprisingly choose national independence over foreign control. After the nationalization of oil, the United Kingdom responded aggressively, but because of the harsh response by the British over time, the coalition began to break apart. Different groups started turning against Mossadegh. And who were those groups who didn't want the independence and sovereign rights? Well, religious leaders who feared secular reforms. Some officers preferred monarchy as well. Some officers were bribed, and others worried about instability. So, Mohammad Reza Shah gradually regained political weight as a monarch. Iran was becoming deeply divided. As Mossadegh lost support, he took increasingly risky decisions. In 1953, he dissolved the Majlis, the parliament, and began ruling under emergency powers. This was a turning point. Before, he had been seen as a democratic nationalist, Now he began to look authoritarian. This undermined his legitimacy and weakened his position even further. At the same time, foreign powers saw an opportunity. For Britain, and increasingly for the United States, removing Mossadegh became a strategic goal. This led to Operation Ajax. The plan was clear: weaken Mossadegh politically, isolate him, and ultimately remove him from power. The first attempt came in August 1953. The Shah signed a decree dismissing Mossadegh from office. This was significant because Shah was still a legitimate authority under the constitution, but Mossadegh found out in advance. He acted quickly. He arrested the officers involved. He blocked the attempt. The coup appeared to have failed. For a moment it seemed that Mossadegh had won, but the story did not end with the failed coup attempt. At this point, the United Kingdom changed strategy. Unable to act alone, it turned to the United States. This was the early Cold War period, a time of intense fear of communism. In the United States, anti-communist sentiment was extremely strong, shaped by what is known as McCarthyism. In this atmosphere, even the possibility of a country drifting towards Soviet influence was seen as a serious threat. British officials successfully convinced the Central Intelligence Agency (CIA) to intervene in Iran. Together with British intelligence, they launched a coordinated effort to overthrow Mossadegh. The methods used were complex and carefully planned. They included bribing politicians, bribing government officials, influencing newspapers and media, spreading propaganda and rumors, organizing paid demonstrations, mobilizing street groups and gangs. Tehran was gradually flooded with unrest and confusion. Some protests supported the Shah. "Long live the Shah," they shouted. Others appeared to support Mossadegh, but were deliberately staged to create chaos and discredit him. Mossadegh was portrayed as a dictator, anti-religious, even a potential communist. In reality, he was a nationalist, but the propaganda successfully weakened his support. The economic crisis caused by the embargo made things worse. Public frustration grew, and in the end, everything depended on one key factor: the army. Critical military units, some already influenced or bribed, shifted their loyalty to the Shah. In August 1953, they moved into action. Tehran was taken. Mossadegh's resistance was attacked and bombarded. Facing defeat, he surrendered. The coup succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to prison. After 3 years, he was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the Shah returned to power, this time with full authority and strong backing from the United States and Britain. This marked a decisive turning point in Iran's modern history. After the 1953 coup, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi consolidated power and transformed Iran into a much more authoritarian state. In many ways, the country returned to a system similar to the rule of his father, Reza Shah, centralized, controlled, and politically restricted. However, there was one key difference. This time the Shah was strongly backed by the United States. Political opposition was increasingly suppressed, and the monarchy became the dominant force in Iranian politics. But the consequences were not only political, they were also economic. After the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, A new international oil arrangement was created. Previously, Iran's oil had been dominated by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Now, broader international consortium took control. The distribution of oil interests changed significantly. British Petroleum received about 40%, American companies together received about 40%. There were also French and Dutch. Major American firms became deeply involved, including Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of New Jersey. As a result, the United States gained a major economic stake in Iran's oil industry. This marked a shift from primarily British control to shared Western control over Iranian resources. While the coup secured Western strategic and economic interests, it also had long-term consequences inside Iran. Many Iranians began to see the Shah as dependent on foreign powers. This perception would later contribute to growing dissatisfaction and eventually major upheaval in the decades to come. To maintain control, the Shah strengthened his rule and limited political opposition. Like his father, Reza Shah, he reduced the power of parliament and restricted democratic processes. One of the most important tools he created was the secret police, Savak, established in 1957 with assistance from the Central Intelligence Agency and, surprise, Mossad, the Israelis. It's hard to believe today, but back then they were friends. That infamous Savak became a powerful instrument of state control. Its role included surveillance, arrest of political opponents, suppression of dissent, intimidation, and torture. As a result, Iran increasingly resembled a police state. At the same time, there were economic changes. After the coup, a new oil agreement was signed in 1954. Under this system, Iran indeed received a 50-50 share. At the same time, Iran under the Shah developed close ties with Western countries and Israel. In summary, the Shah's regime rested on two pillars: external support from Western powers and strong internal control, basically through repression. The main group targeted were communists and Islamist movements. During the Cold War, communists were seen as a major threat because of possible ties to the Soviet Union. As a result, they were heavily suppressed and forced underground. At the same time, another powerful opposition began to emerge: Islamist groups. Unlike the communists, they were not seen as foreign influenced, but rather as authentic representatives of Iranian identity. This was especially important because Iran is predominantly Shia Muslim. Religious leaders criticized the Shah's policies, particularly rapid modernization, Western influence, social and cultural changes, and they were pushed underground by the regime. Through Savak, the Shah maintained control by fear and repression. Despite this political repression, Iran experienced significant economic growth during the 1960s and 1970s. With increased oil revenues and strong ties to Western countries, Iran became one of the fastest growing economies in the region. In major cities like Tehran, signs of modernization were highly visible. Urban life reflected Western-style influence, such as modern infrastructure, consumer culture, change in fashion and lifestyles. For some, this period symbolized progress and prosperity, but for others, it represented cultural loss, growing inequality, and disconnection from tradition. Like in many capitalist systems, economic inequality increased. The gap between rich and poor widened. Cities developed faster than rural areas. The countryside remained underdeveloped, and required major reforms. The Shah did try to reform the countryside with his land reform. It was part of a broader modernization program known as the White Revolution. The goal was to break up large estates and redistribute land to peasants. But in practice, the reform was only partially successful. Many peasants received too little land to sustain themselves. As a result, large numbers migrated to cities in search of work. This led to urban overcrowding, growth of slums, rising poverty in cities. At the same time, other reforms were introduced. Women gained the right to vote, education expanded, industrialization accelerated. While these reforms aimed to modernize the country, they also created opposition. One of the strongest sources of resistance came from religious leaders. The backlash was led by Ruhollah Khomeini. The clergy opposed several aspects of the Shah's policies, such as secularization of society, growing Western influence, expansion of women's rights, because traditionally religious authorities held significant influence over Iranian society, but modernization threatened that role. For many clerics, these reforms were seen not as progress but as an attack on Islamic values. At the same time, economic frustrations continued to grow. The combination of inequality, failed reforms, cultural tension, and political repression created widespread dissatisfaction. Many people from urban poor to religious groups to parts of the middle class felt excluded from the benefits of modernization. So by the 1970s, Iran was facing a deep social crisis. As dissatisfaction increased, people began to question the legitimacy of the Shah's rule. A revolutionary situation was gradually emerging. By the 1970s, many Iranians began asking a fundamental question: how did the Shah come to power? The answer was increasingly uncomfortable. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was not seen as a leader who had earned his authority through struggle or national achievement. Instead, he was associated with foreign intervention, especially the 1953 coup supported by the United States and the United Kingdom. This weakened his legitimacy in the eyes of many citizens. A useful comparison can be made with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who introduced similar modernization reforms in Turkey, but he was widely respected because he had led military resistance. He defended national independence. He earned authority through action. In contrast, the Shah lacked this kind of historical legitimacy. He was often perceived as dependent on foreign powers rather than rooted in national struggle. At the same time, his personal image further damaged his reputation. Many people associated him with luxury, with wealth, and distance from ordinary life. One striking example was the extravagant celebration of the Persian monarchy in 1971. This event, attended by global elites and foreign leaders, cost enormous sums of money. While the ruling elite celebrated, many ordinary Iranians were facing poverty. This contrast became a powerful symbol of injustice. As dissatisfaction grew, opposition movements, especially religious groups, gained credibility. They were increasingly seen as authentic. At the same time, continued political repression only made the situation worse. The more the regime tried to control society, the more unpopular it became. By the late 1970s, Iran had become a society ready to explode. In 1979, this tension finally erupted into the Iranian Revolution. that was led by the Shia cleric Ruhollah Khomeini. He strongly opposed the Western influence and the Shah's authoritarian rule. At the center of his ideology was a new political concept, Wilayat-e-Faqih. This idea proposed that political authority should belong to a leading Islamic scholar, not a monarch, and not a purely secular parliament. This was revolutionary because it transformed religion into a system of government. Khomeini had already challenged the Shah earlier. In 1963, he openly criticized the Shah, which led to his arrest, mass protests, and violent repression. 1 year later, in 1964, he was exiled, first to Iraq, then later to France. But exile did not end his influence. From abroad, he continued to lead the opposition movement. His messages were spread through cassette recordings, mosques, underground networks. Over time, he became a powerful symbol of resistance. So in January 1979, the Shah left Iran. His departure created a powerful vacuum. Without clear leadership, the regime collapsed, and in February 1979, Khomeini returned to Iran. He quickly moved to take control, rejecting the monarchy, rejecting compromise, establishing a new political order. The revolution succeeded, the monarchy ended, and Iran was transformed into an Islamic Republic. Now, here is where things get really interesting, because this system is not simple. It's not just democracy, it's not just dictatorship. It's something in between. On one hand, you have an elected president, a parliament. So yes, people vote. There are elections, there is representation. And at first glance, you may think this is democracy. But above all of that, there is the very powerful supreme leader. And that position is taken by Khomeini. The supreme leader has ultimate authority, not symbolic, not ceremonial, like in a constitutional monarchy. He has a real power. So imagine this system like layers, elections at the bottom, institutions in the middle, and at the top, someone who can override everything. The system also creates its own military force. Important. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now this is crucial because this force is not like a normal army. It is not fully controlled by the elected government. Instead, it is directly loyal to the supreme leader. So now you have a regular army and a parallel ideological army. And politically, other groups are pushed out. Liberals removed, leftists suppressed, communists crushed. So what started as a broad revolution quickly becomes a very specific kind of system. Also, now, if we switch to the foreign policy, Iran chooses neither side in the Cold War, not the United States, not the Soviet Union. Instead, it becomes something new, an independent ideological power. And that's rare, because most countries at that time were aligned with one bloc or the other. This creates a very complicated situation because Iran ends up having multiple enemies at once. The United States, the Soviet Union, and regionally Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein. Now, here is an interesting twist. Under the Shah, Iran actually had good relations with Israel. But after the revolution, everything changes. Long-term, Israel becomes major enemy. In fact, Iran's leadership adopts a very strong ideological position. Israel is an enemy. Israel must be destroyed. And this is where we see something very important. Ideology begins to dominate geopolitics. Because if you think about it logically, Iran and Israel don't even share a border, they are far apart. So, from a purely strategic perspective, you could ask, why fight this conflict? Why spend resources on it? And the answer is ideology. This is no longer just about territory or direct threats. It's about beliefs, it's about identity, it's about vision of the world. And that's what makes post-revolution Iran so unique and so influential. So in the end, the revolution changed how the state works, how power is structured, how Iran sees the world, and most importantly, it created a system that still shapes global politics today. It changed how Iran behaves both inside and outside the country. Iran started building connections with other Shia movements across the region. And this matters a lot in the Middle East, because in Iraq, Shia Muslims are the majority. In Lebanon, there is a significant Shia population. So Iran begins to see itself not just as a country, but as a leader of wider religious community. Now, relations between the United States and Iran is a topic that deserves special attention. After the revolution, they collapsed completely, and the breaking point comes during the Iran hostage crisis. This is a dramatic moment, almost cinematic. Revolutionary students, angry, politicized, and deeply suspicious, gather outside the US Embassy in Tehran. And in their view, this is not just an embassy, it is a symbol of past interference. When protests escalate, the embassy staff realizes the danger. And what do they start doing? Destroying documents, shredding files. The crowd breaks in, they climb over the gates, they enter the embassy compound. Some staff manage to escape, but many do not. 52 American diplomats and staff are taken hostage. And now this becomes a full-scale international crisis. Because this is not just a protest anymore. This is a violation of fundamental diplomatic rules. And it permanently damages relations between the two countries. And isn't it an interesting question why the students needed to storm the embassy at all? Because events like the hostage crisis don't just appear out of nowhere. There is always a trigger. And in this case, the trigger comes in October 1979. The United States allows Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi to enter the country, officially for medical treatment. Well, he was really ill for a long time, but from the perspective of the new Iranian leadership, this does not look neutral. This looks political, because for the revolutionaries in Iran, the Shah is not just a former ruler, he is someone who must face justice. They believe he should be returned, he should stand trial, he should answer for his actions. And most importantly, they see this as a domestic issue. In their view, who rules Iran is for Iranians to decide. So when the United States gives shelter to the Shah, it sends a signal: we are taking a side. And this is where history matters, because Iranians remember past foreign interventions happened from the embassies. So they begin to think, is this happening again? Are we about to see another coup? And at this point, there is a feeling of not again. There's even this idea almost like a lesson learned. We are not stepping on the same rake twice. So, what do they decide? We need to eliminate the risk. And in their view, That risk is the US embassy. After the embassy is taken, the students make demands: return the Shah, put him on trial, admit past interference, say sorry for your wrongdoings. Now here is where things get even more dramatic. Remember those shredded documents? The students don't just throw them away, they piece them back together. Imagine that for a second, hundreds, thousands of shredded pages being reconstructed. That's patience, or anger, or both. And what do they claim to find? Evidence of intelligence activities, networks of influence in the region. And when this is made public, it becomes a huge scandal. From their perspective, we were right, there was interference. But at the same time, capturing an embassy is still an act of aggression. So this creates a contradiction. On one hand, they believe they are defending sovereignty. On the other hand, they are violating international law. And now enters Ruhollah Khomeini. At first, this action is carried out by students, but very quickly he supports it. Why? Because politically it works. It helps him unite the country, strengthen the revolution, eliminate international divisions, and it taps into something powerful: national pride. Because now the narrative becomes, we are standing up to foreign powers, we are defending our independence, and people support that because they remember what happened before with foreign interference, with coups, with outside control. That can happen again. So this moment becomes more than just a crisis, it becomes a symbol of resistance. And this moment does something very important politically. It eliminates rivals. During the revolution, there were many different groups: religious forces, liberals, leftists. They were all united against the Shah. But once the Shah is gone, they are no longer united. Now they become competitors for power. The liberals, those who wanted relations with the West, now they look suspicious. And in a revolutionary atmosphere, that is politically dangerous. So what happens? Moderates are discredited, alternative voices are weakened, and step by step, Khomeini removes his rivals from the political scene. This is how he consolidates power. And at the same time, the nature of the revolution changes. What started as a broad movement becomes a clearly Islamic system. Iran does become independent, but independence comes with a cost: isolation. It stands alone. Over time, new relationships will form. After the Cold War, Iran develops ties with Russia, China, and regional actors like Armenia. Relations with Azerbaijan remain more complex and sometimes tense, but that is another story.